Hi guys, I'm Lindsey Duga, author of Kiss the Royal, Glow the Fireflies, The Haunting, and Roaring, my new young adult paranormal romance set in the 1920s. I'm super excited to jump into these questions, so let's go ahead and get started. Is there something special about Roaring that you want everyone to know? Your inspiration, maybe? A fun hidden fact? So, I think what separates Roaring from most other young adult 1920s books is that I don't focus very much on the flapper lifestyle. I don't focus on the modern girl and the upper echelons of society and all of the money and the great Gatsby part of it. I focus more on the underbelly. I focus more on the organized crime and mobsters part of the 1920s because we always forget that even though crime, of course, existed before the 1920s, organized crime didn't. Or at least that's what gave rise to organized crime is the 1920s. We think of Al Capone and, we even think of The Sopranos with the 1920s. We think of mobsters in that way. Um, so I wanted to really highlight that aspect of the Prohibition era in Roaring. And the best way to do that was to weave in part of the world building into this organized crime scene. So when I knew that I wanted to make Roaring have monsters in it, and I wanted my main character to literally be a mythological creature, a siren, I wanted to figure out how to weave my paranormal aspects into that organized crime. So there gave birth the idea of a monster trade. So you have all of these different monster parts like vampire fangs and Gorgon's hair and minotaur horns and a cyclops eye. So I thought of all these monster parts and I thought maybe they can be a part of the organized crime. Maybe they can be smuggling monster parts. So whenever I started thinking about that idea, the entire world just started to come together and fuse together. So I think that would be the part I want people to walk away with is how I was able to weave in this paranormal aspect into something that felt very organic for this time period. And I hope everybody really enjoys that part of the book. Question one. From start to finish of a book, what does your writing process look like? So I think about my books a lot before I actually start writing anything. I think about the characters, the setting, the plot, the relationships, favorite scenes that I'm really excited to write about, especially the kiss scenes. I think about that while walking my dog, exercising, cooking. It's always in the back of my head. And sometimes I'm working on another book and drafting and editing another book at the same time I'm thinking about this new one. So by the time I actually sit down to write my synopsis, I have most of the book planned out. So it only takes me a couple sittings to write through the entire synopsis. Once I have that synopsis approved by either my editor or my agent, I jump right into drafting, and that typically takes me 2 to 3 months as well. So that's what my process looks like. There's a lot of thinking, and then once I sit down, I finally get to hash out the book, and that's where the editing comes in, of course. Okay, question two. What drew you to write about the 1920s? Well, I've always been a really big fan of the Prohibition era. It's a really, really interesting time period in our history. I mean, if you think about it, it's kind of crazy. We outlawed alcohol, and everyone basically said no collectively, and we all became criminals. We went to speakeasies. Rum running became practically a real profession. It was a very interesting, crazy time period. And I've always been in love with that aesthetic as well. I love The Great Gatsby. I'm a big musical fan, so I love Chicago, Thoroughly Modern Millie, even Crazy for You has some really good 1920 songs in there. Um, and then, whenever I first came up with the idea, I had this idea of a girl who's a singer and she's a siren. And the best place that I could possibly think to have a singer who is a monster in any type of era or any type of setting, whether that be fantasy or anything, the first thing that came to my mind were speakeasies. So the idea pretty much came from there. And also, it's just a really, really fun time period to play with. Question 3. What kind of research did you do on that time period to bring a sense of history and authenticity to your books? So, first, I Googled. I think that is the go to for most authors these days. In fact, I don't know how writers wrote anything before the internet. It's just the best way to find research. However, I did try to make my sources as credible as possible. So, most of the sites that I went to were either from library sites or from museum websites. Um, in fact, I think there was literally a Chicago speakeasy museum site that I went to, which was incredibly helpful. I researched things like mobsters, speakeasies, of course, the slang, which I wanted to be as authentic as possible. In fact, there was a lot of helpful dictionaries and articles that were online that helped me out with that slang. And I wanted to use all those terms, but I also didn't want it to be too complicated for the reader. Like, I wanted people to understand that without having to flip to the glossary every time. So I tried to make those terms as contextual as possible, and my editor helped me a lot with that. But in terms of other things, it just felt like a rabbit hole. Like, I would click on one link and then I would be like, oh, I didn't know they did that in that time period. And then I would click on another link and it would take me over there. But then I started researching very specific things for scenes in my book. So, for example, they take trains a lot. And I wanted to make sure those train schedules were realistic. So, could they travel from Boston to Philly, and how long was that going to take? And could they travel from, Chicago to another city across the lake? Did it work that way? Um, so there was a lot of those questions that I answered that I had to research. And a lot of the scenes that I used were taken directly from old photos. So there's this one point where they're in Philadelphia standing under the Delaware River Bridge, and I particularly put them in that spot because I found a photograph that I was able to use and describe really well. So there were some of those authentic scenes that I took through my research, and it just led me every which way. And I honestly think researching for this book was one of the best times I've had while ever writing a book. It was really fun for me. Question 4. If you could have dinner with any author, alive or dead, who would it be and why? Uh, I guess I'm gonna skip the obvious J.K. Rowling for multiple reasons and go straight to Marissa Meyer. I love the Lunar Chronicles. It is hands down my favorite young adult series. Um, I love the way she created sci-fi and fairy tales. If you can't tell, I'm a big fairy tale person. I love fairy tale retellings. But I also really love the fact that that world and those characters were greatly inspired by Sailor Moon. I know she's a big Sailor Moon fan, as am I. I had all the manga, watched the anime as a kid, loved all the movies, big Sailor Moon nerd. So I would love to sit down and talk to her about Sailor Moon. I'd love to talk to her about how her love for that show influenced how she wrote the Lunar Chronicles. And then I would want to tell her, oh my gosh, I love Captain Thorn and I love him and Cress. And I'm fangirling just thinking about sitting down and talking to her about that series. I'm in love with it. So yeah, definitely Marissa Meyer. Question 5. What is your favorite underappreciated book and why? I would have to say the book Far, Far Away by Tom McNeill. In fact, I think I have it right here. Yes, I do. So this book is really, really really good. It's beautifully written, and it's a very interesting concept. So it's actually written from the perspective of a ghost. And the ghost is the ghost of one of the brothers Grimm. So it's very fairy tale esque. And the story actually follows a young boy that lives in a small town who falls in love with this girl. And there's a local legend that there's a bakery in town that if you ever eat this pastry at a certain time, at a certain day, then that whoever gives the person to that pastry, whoever eats it, will fall in love with that person. So there's a lot more to it than that. You think on the surface level it's going to be a cute fairy tale retelling esque, but there's a lot of darkness underneath a very seemingly innocent story. So I highly recommend Far, Far Away by Tom McNeill. And it's such a pretty cover. Look how simple it is. And it says, in a small town where nothing ever happens, everything is about to change. So it's a really simple tagline, but it hooked me in pretty quickly. And I haven't found anybody who's read that book. So I guess it's kind of underappreciated. Question 7. How do you take your tea? Milk, sugar, lemon, hot, cold? It depends on the type of tea that I'm drinking. So if it is herbal or black or white or anything like that, I need to have it hot. I like hot tea, and I actually don't like any sugar or honey with it. I like to taste the distinct flavors, and I feel like if you sweeten it, it just kind of loses that. Um, but if I am drinking green tea matcha, then I definitely have to have that in a latte. My favorite drink from Starbucks is the green tea matcha iced lattes with soy milk. That is productivity to me. That is how I write books sometimes, is drinking that constantly. Yeah, so that's how I take it. Just depends on the type of tea. Question 8. Is Orange Pekoe tea your favorite tea flavor like it is for Colt? How did you choose that particular tea to use in Roaring? Oh, that's a good question. No, it is not my favorite tea. In fact, I've never actually had it. In fact, whenever I was researching the 1920s and I knew I didn't want Colt to be a typical coffee drinker, I wanted him to drink tea because I had a very specific scene in mind. So when I was researching, like, what kind of tea did people drink in the 1920s? Was it just normal black? Was there a popular brand that I could use to make sure it was authentic as possible? I found a advertisement for Orange Pekoe tea, and I kept finding that everywhere. Everywhere I looked for that type of tea, I kept finding that same advertisement. So it must have been pretty popular. And I used that, and then I just continued to sort of use it throughout the book, and it lent itself really well. But my favorite type of tea is, or the flavor is called Mr. Darcy. And it is a chocolate covered strawberry flavor tea. That particular tea is found from a local tea place that I go to. It's called the English Tea Room. It's in Covington, Louisiana. And I go there and I drink that all the time. It is perfect with any kind of sweets. That's my favorite tea. Good question.